I knew the sentence. I felt it sitting behind my teeth like something metallic, like a piece of shrapnel I could not swallow and could not spit out. It was not a speech. It was not even an argument. It was a simple warning, plain enough to say in a hallway without stopping anyone, short enough to fit between two footsteps. And still, I held it back, as if the act of speaking would set off an alarm no one else could hear. There are moments when your body betrays you, not with panic, with obedience. My throat stayed open and empty. My tongue rested where it always rested. My face kept its normal shape. I nodded at the right times. I let my eyes move like they were listening, like they were taking in the world and accepting it. I learned that you can look calm while a thought screams inside you. You can appear loyal while your conscience keeps reaching for the same door handle over and over. The strange part was how ordinary it felt. Not the fear itself. Fear was constant. It lived in the rooms before you entered them. It hung in coats on the wall. It slept on the bunks beside you. It was so common you stopped calling it fear. You called it discipline. You called it patience. You called it knowing your place. But this was different. This was the feeling of standing beside a mistake that had not happened yet, watching it gather shape the way weather gathers beyond a ridge. The sky still clear. The air still steady. Everyone still moving as if nothing could change. And you, alone with the knowledge that something was already wrong. I tried to convince myself it was only suspicion, that I was imagining patterns because I was tired, because my nerves had been rubbed raw by days that did not end, that I was overestimating my understanding, that it was arrogance to think I saw something others did not. That last excuse was the easiest to hold. It sounded humble. It sounded safe. It sounded like respect. Respect was a language everyone spoke. It was the only language that never got you punished. If you kept your voice measured and your questions soft, you could survive almost anything. If you kept your thoughts private, you could last longer than men who said what they meant. I had watched it happen before. A remark made too plainly. A concern raised at the wrong time. A small correction offered in a room that did not want corrections. Nothing dramatic, no shouting, no explosion of anger. Just a pause, a look, a silence that turned sharp, and afterward a subtle shift. Assignments changed, access narrowed, conversations ended when you entered. Like a door closing with no sound. People thought power was loud. It wasn't. Power was the ability to make you disappear without moving. So I weighed the words the way you weigh a match near spilled fuel. Not because I cared about myself more than anyone else. That would have been too simple, too clean. The truth is uglier. I cared about being right in the wrong way. I cared about not being the one who disrupted the order of things. I cared about not being seen as the kind of person who complicates a plan that has already been spoken aloud. Plans have a gravity. Once they are said, they pull everyone into them. The room rearranges itself around the decision. Objects become tools. Men become pieces. Even doubt becomes a kind of betrayal. I felt that gravity in the way people stood closer together after the words were spoken. In the way the air thickened with purpose. In the way pens moved. In the way eyes stopped wandering and fixed themselves forward. It was like watching a line form, quiet and confident, and realizing you were the only one not fully inside it. I told myself, if it's wrong, someone else will notice. I told myself, if it's dangerous, it will be corrected. I told myself, I am not the one who decides. And beneath those thoughts, beneath the neat logic I stacked like sandbags, I felt something else, something more honest. A small, desperate hope that I could remain uninvolved, that I could keep my hands clean by keeping them still, that silence could be mistaken for innocence. My heart kept its rhythm. My breathing stayed even. My face stayed neutral. Inside, the warning kept pressing against the back of my mouth. I waited for the right moment. Then the moment arrived and passed without me. And when the room moved on, as if the question had never existed, as if the risk had never been visible, I understood, with a cold clarity, that I had already chosen. I said nothing. The place where I served did not reward understanding. It rewarded timing. There were schedules for everything, when lights went out, when fuel was drawn, when engines were tested, when messages were carried from one room to another and turned into other messages by the time they arrived. Even quiet had its assigned hours. Silence was not the absence of sound. It was a standard. Every morning began with the same controlled motion. Boots, straps, paper, metal, faces that had learned to hold expression like a locked drawer. Men spoke in short phrases. They did not waste breath on what could not be recorded, what could not be repeated to someone higher up without sounding weak. The higher you went, the fewer words you heard. Orders were brief. Explanations were shorter. Questions were treated like delays, and delays were treated like failure. I was not one of the men whose voice could slow a room. I existed close enough to the machinery of decisions to hear them being assembled, but not close enough to touch the lever. I moved between spaces where authority sat and spaces where labor happened. I carried things. I read things. I wrote things down that were not mine to rewrite. There were rooms I could enter without knocking, and rooms I could only pass by as if they were sealed. In the main planning space, air was always stale. Not from smoke, though there was plenty of that, but from the steady recycling of urgency. Maps lay open like wounds that never closed. Lines and marks accumulated until the paper looked bruised. Tables were crowded with instruments and cups and ash, all arranged with the kind of careless precision that comes from men who do not believe they can be told no. The walls had their own language, notices, procedures, codes, timetables, lists of what had to happen and who had to report it. There was comfort in that, even for people who pretended they felt none. If everything could be written, then everything could be controlled. Outside those rooms, the war was a constant low vibration. Trucks shifting gears, distant artillery like weather, the occasional stutter of aircraft overhead. It did not roar all the time. It pressed. It waited. It made every conversation feel like it was taking place under a ceiling that might crack. The chain of command was not an abstract idea. It was physical. You could see it in the way men stood. When someone important entered, bodies adjusted without being told. Backs straighter. Hands still. Voices softened. The room changed temperature by a degree. No one announced this, no one admitted it. It simply happened, the way a flock turns in the air. I watched this because watching was my safest posture. The men who made decisions did not look like villains. They looked exhausted. They had ink stains on their fingers. They had creases in their uniforms where they slept sitting up. They spoke as if their voices were made of gravel from days of not resting. And still, the power in their tone was absolute. Not because they were cruel, but because the system required them to sound certain, even when certainty did not exist. Certainty was a weapon. Doubt was a weakness. Weakness was contagious. In that environment, speech was never just speech. It had consequences that reached beyond the moment. A sentence could mark you, not as wrong, but as unsafe. There was an unspoken rule that everyone knew. You could discuss problems only after they were already happening. Before that, the problem was theoretical, which meant it was inconvenient, which meant it was disrespect. I saw men who had learned this rule too late. A junior officer once tried to point out a mismatch between two sets of figures, quietly, politely, almost apologetically. He was not challenging anyone. He was offering a correction like a man offering water. The room went still anyway, not with anger, with assessment. The person at the table did not raise his voice. He simply asked a few questions, calmly, the way you inspect a tool to see if it's defective. Afterward, the junior officer remained in the unit, but he was no longer brought into certain meetings. His name stopped appearing on certain lists. He became useful in a smaller way. Not punished. Reduced. Another time, someone spoke up about timing. Just timing, nothing ideological, nothing dramatic. He suggested waiting for better visibility, for more information. The response was not a rebuke. It was laughter, brief and bitter, followed by a reminder that war does not wait for ideal conditions. The man who spoke up flushed and fell silent, and for the rest of the week no one asked him what he thought about anything. It was never said aloud, but we all understood. The price of being the first to voice doubt was that you became the doubt. You became the delay. You became the obstacle the system would learn to avoid. So the hierarchy did its work without needing to threaten anyone. It trained people to censor themselves. It turned caution into shame. And that is how it kept moving. On paper, there were procedures for raising concerns. There were channels. There were official phrases for objections, phrased in the careful language of protocol. But those channels ran uphill, and uphill was steep. By the time a concern reached the top, it had been softened, turned into a suggestion, wrapped in deference. Often it never reached the top at all. Men told themselves it would be handled elsewhere, or they waited for someone with a better voice to say it first. I did the same. I told myself I was not important enough to matter, that my understanding was partial, that I saw only fragments of the whole, that my place was to support, not to interfere. I told myself this while I watched the routine. I watched how plans were spoken into existence and immediately treated as reality. How once a path was drawn on a map, men began to behave as if the ground had already accepted it. How when supplies were scarce, the shortage was not addressed but distributed, quietly, efficiently. So no one above had to hear the word impossible. In that world, admitting a problem was often treated as creating one. And slowly, almost without realizing it, I began to understand what my real job was. It wasn't carrying papers or relaying messages. It was absorbing doubt so it would not enter the room. It was feeling the hesitation privately so the machine could continue without friction. And then, one day, the uneasy thought I had been holding stopped being a vague sense of wrongness. It sharpened. It attached itself to something specific that was being discussed, measured, decided. Not yet as an order. Not yet as a command stamped and final, but as a direction the room was already leaning into, confidently, quietly, while my silence sat beside me like a loaded weight. The thought did not arrive all at once. It assembled itself in pieces, the way a story does when you already know the ending but refuse to say it aloud. At first it was only a discrepancy, a detail that didn't line up the way it should have. Numbers that looked correct individually but uneasy together. Timing that seemed acceptable on paper and strained in reality. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would stop a meeting. Just enough to make my mind circle back to the same place again and again. I told myself it was nerves. That fatigue had thinned my judgment, that after long enough in that environment, everyone begins to see threats where there are only inconveniences. Still, the thought persisted. It followed me through corridors and into briefings. It sat with me during meals I barely tasted. It returned at night when the noise of the day faded and there was nothing left to distract me from it. I would replay conversations in my head, hearing not what was said, but what was assumed. The confidence in certain phrases, the finality in others. The problem was not that no one cared. The problem was that everyone cared in the same direction. Plans had momentum. Once the outline was agreed upon, every subsequent discussion served only to refine it, not to question it. Questions that aligned with the plan were welcomed. Questions that threatened its foundation were not asked, because asking them would require admitting that the foundation itself might be flawed. I imagined myself speaking, not boldly, not dramatically, just a quiet interjection placed carefully, respectfully. I imagined the room turning toward me, not with anger, but with surprise. I imagined the pause, the kind that feels longer than it is, while everyone recalibrated. In some versions of that moment, the concern was acknowledged, not praised, but considered. The plan adjusted slightly, a delay introduced, a precaution added. Nothing heroic, nothing that would earn me a name. But in most versions, the outcome was different. In most versions, my voice marked me, even if I was right. I imagined the subtle shift in how I would be seen afterward, the way my name would be associated with complication, with hesitation, with being difficult, not insubordinate, not rebellious, just unreliable in moments that demanded certainty. I had seen what happened to men who became associated with doubt. They were not expelled. They were sidelined. Their opinions stopped being sought. Their presence became optional. And in war, being optional is dangerous. So I built arguments against myself. I reminded myself of everything I did not know, the information I did not have access to, the intelligence that might exist somewhere above me, neatly resolving the concern I couldn't shake. I told myself that if the risk were real, someone else, someone more qualified, would have raised it already. That logic was comforting. It allowed me to believe in the system without fully trusting it. It allowed me to remain passive without admitting cowardice. There was also fear of something more basic, fear of being wrong. Not wrong in the abstract, but wrong in a way that wasted time, resources, attention. Wrong in front of men who were already carrying more weight than they could show. Wrong in a setting where mistakes were tolerated only if they came from the right mouths. If I spoke and the concern proved unfounded, I would not just be incorrect. I would have interrupted the flow. I would have forced the room to slow down for something that resolved into nothing. And nothing was unforgivable when time was scarce. So I waited. I waited for a clearer sign, for confirmation, for the thought to either dissolve or become undeniable. I told myself that silence for now was not a decision. It was caution. But silence has a way of deepening. Each time the plan was mentioned without my objection, it became harder to object the next time. Each nod I gave felt like an agreement. Each agreement felt like complicity. And yet, breaking that pattern felt heavier with every repetition. The imagined moment of speaking moved further away. The room felt less receptive. The plan felt more solid, more real, more difficult to touch. I began to notice how often this happened to others. How men would exchange glances during briefings and say nothing. How concerns were expressed only in private, only after the fact, only to people who could not act on them. How fear did not always look like panic. Sometimes it looked like professionalism. And I told myself I was being professional. I told myself that discipline meant trusting the structure, even when it felt uncomfortable. That my responsibility was to execute, not to interfere. That conscience was a luxury for people with authority. Still, the thought remained. It sharpened each time the plan moved closer to execution. Each time a detail was locked in. Each time an assumption was treated as fact. It was no longer just an abstract risk. It was a trajectory. I could see where it might lead, not in images of destruction, but in smaller, quieter failures that accumulate. Delays, miscalculations, men placed where they should not be. Resources stretched thinner than admitted. A chain of events that would be difficult to stop once it began. And in my mind, there was always the same fork in the road. One path where I spoke, briefly, carefully, and accepted whatever followed. Another where I stayed quiet and told myself that silence was not the same as agreement. I stood at that fork longer than I want to admit, and with each passing moment, the weight of not choosing grew heavier than the fear of choosing wrong. But still, I did not speak. The moment did not announce itself. It did not arrive with raised voices or sudden movement. It came quietly, wrapped in routine, disguised as another step in a process that had already been rehearsed too many times to feel dangerous. We were gathered the way we always were, papers laid out, instruments aligned, the same faces in roughly the same positions, as if the room itself had memorized us. The discussion moved forward with a steady rhythm, each statement building on the last, each assumption reinforcing the one before it. I felt it before I understood it, a tightening just below the ribs, a dryness in my mouth that had nothing to do with thirst. My hands, resting flat against the surface in front of me, went numb at the edges, like circulation had been redirected elsewhere. The words were coming, not from me, from the room. A conclusion was forming, not spoken yet, but inevitable. You could feel it in the way sentences shortened, in the way questions stopped being exploratory and started being confirmatory. The plan was no longer being discussed. It was being finalized. This was the moment I had imagined so many times that it almost felt rehearsed. All I had to do was speak before the sentence ended. Not loudly, not forcefully, just enough to interrupt the flow, just enough to introduce friction. I felt my body prepare and resist at the same time. My breath caught halfway in, as if my lungs had decided independently that now was not the time. My jaw tightened, then relaxed, then tightened again. The warning I had carried for days pressed forward, fully formed now, clear and undeniable. I knew exactly what I would say. I also knew exactly what would happen the instant I said it. Every eye would turn, not sharply, not accusingly, but attentively. The room would pause. Someone would ask me to explain. My explanation would sound thinner when spoken aloud than it had in my head. Not wrong, just insufficient. Too many qualifiers. Too much uncertainty for a decision that demanded confidence. Someone higher up would respond. Calmly, perhaps even kindly. They would acknowledge the concern and then place it inside a larger framework that made it seem manageable, theoretical, already accounted for. The plan would continue anyway. And afterward, I would be remembered not for being right or wrong, but for hesitating at the wrong time. The sentence in the room reached its end. There was a brief pause, the natural space where someone else could have spoken if they needed to. That pause was mine. It felt heavier than anything I had carried in that place. My heart beat once, hard enough that I wondered if it was visible. My fingers twitched against the surface in front of me, a small, involuntary movement that I hoped no one noticed. I swallowed finely, the way you swallow something sharp and convince yourself it will pass. The pause closed. Another voice picked up where the last one left off, smooth and confident. The decision moved forward, no longer abstract, no longer reversible without effort. Pens moved. Notes were made, timetables adjusted. The moment was gone. I sat there, perfectly still, listening to my own silence echo louder than anything that had been said. There was no immediate regret, no dramatic collapse of resolve, just a dull, spreading awareness that something irreversible had happened. Not in the room, but in me. I had crossed a line without moving. The warning I had carried did not disappear. It settled. It sank deeper, becoming heavier, more solid, as if it had found a place to stay. I realized then that silence is not empty. It accumulates. The meeting continued. Details were addressed. Responsibilities assigned. The machinery turned smoothly, indifferent to what had not entered it. No one looked at me differently. No one knew. That was the worst part. Because in that moment, when I could still have changed the shape of what was coming, even slightly, I had chosen to remain exactly what the system needed me to be. Quiet. And when the order finally took its full form, stamped and unquestioned, my silence was already inside it. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They came the way truth often does in war, piecemeal, wrapped in routine, diluted by distance, easy to ignore until they were no longer distant at all. At first, everything looked normal. Movements occurred on schedule. Reports came in with the expected tone, measured, controlled, careful not to suggest alarm. Delays were explained away as weather, as logistics, as the ordinary friction of operations. No one spoke the word failure. No one needed to. I listened more closely than before. I began to notice what was not being said, the gaps between updates, the slight adjustments in language, phrases that softened reality just enough to make it manageable. Complications, unexpected resistance, minor deviations, each one small, each one reasonable on its own. Together they formed a pattern I recognized immediately. It was the pattern I had tried not to name. Men started returning changed, not visibly wounded, not broken in a way that demanded attention, but altered in quieter ways. Their voices were flatter, their movements more deliberate, as if they had learned that haste could be punished without warning. They spoke less about what they had seen and more about what needed to be done next. The system absorbed the losses efficiently. Names were removed from lists. Equipment was reassigned. Timelines were adjusted to account for absence without ever admitting what that absence meant. The machine did not slow. It corrected its balance and continued forward. I found myself searching for confirmation, even though I already had it. Every report that crossed my hands, every message relayed through my presence, I read with a second layer of attention, looking not for information, but for alignment with the fear I had carried. And again I found it. Not stated, not acknowledged, but implied. What I had seen coming was not dramatic enough to force recognition. It was worse than that. It was gradual, incremental, each step survivable on its own. Together, devastating. There were moments when the truth came close to the surface. A conversation cut short, a remark halted mid-sentence, a look exchanged between two men who both understood more than they were willing to articulate. In those moments, I felt the urge to finally speak, to explain that this had not surprised me, that I had known something like this would happen. But those words would have served no purpose. The moment for warning had passed. What remained was explanation, and explanation in war is often mistaken for excuse. So I stayed quiet. I told myself that speaking now would change nothing, that it would only reveal my earlier silence without undoing its effects. That regret spoken aloud does not resurrect anything it arrives too late to save. Still, the weight grew. Every confirmation felt personal, even though no one accused me, even though no one knew. The absence of blame did not relieve me. It intensified the isolation. I was alone with a knowledge that could no longer be useful. At night, when the noise receded and the mind had nothing left to hold on to, I replayed the meeting again. Not the words that were said, but the pause. The fraction of time where everything was still possible, where the future had not yet narrowed. I imagined alternative versions of the same day. A single sentence added, a hesitation acknowledged, a plan adjusted just enough to change its shape, not to prevent everything, but to soften it, to reduce the scale, to give someone a margin they never received. Those thoughts were useless. I knew that. And yet they returned, persistent and detailed, as if my mind believed repetition could retroactively create courage. The aftermath continued to unfold without ceremony. More absences, more quiet recalculations, more careful language. The system adapted as systems do. It learned from the damage without ever naming its cause. Lessons were absorbed in procedure, not in memory, and I moved through it all unchanged on the surface. I performed my duties. I responded when addressed. I did not hesitate where hesitation was not expected. From the outside, nothing about me suggested burden or doubt. Inside, the silence had become something solid. It was no longer just the absence of speech. It was a presence, a constant reminder that I had recognized the shape of what was coming and chosen to let it arrive unchallenged. There were moments when I caught myself listening for something impossible, a chance to speak again, to rewind, to interrupt a different meeting. But war does not offer second openings for the same truth. By the time the full scope of what had happened became undeniable, it was already being absorbed into history, summarized, categorized, reduced to entries that did not include hesitation or conscience, or the quiet decisions of men who said nothing. I watched it become distant even as it stayed close, and in that distance, I understood something that settled heavier than fear or regret. The cost of silence is not paid all at once. It is paid slowly, in every moment where you recognize the consequences of what you did not say, and realize there will never be a moment where saying it matters again. Time did not absolve anything. It only rearranged the weight. Long after the routines changed and the names stopped appearing on lists, long after the place itself no longer existed in the same form, the silence remained intact. It did not fade the way sounds do. It stayed precise, preserved, like something sealed and stored. Memory became selective in ways I did not control. I could forget dates, I could lose faces. But the pause, that narrow space where my voice should have entered, never blurred. It returned without effort, usually when I was least prepared for it, in moments that had nothing to do with war, in rooms that were safe, in conversations where no one was watching me closely. I learned that silence has an echo that does not need sound. I would be standing somewhere ordinary, waiting, walking, listening, and suddenly feel it again in my chest. The same pressure, the same awareness that a single sentence, once withheld, never dissolves. It only waits. People assume guilt announces itself with emotion, with anguish, with visible distress. Mine did not. It settled into my posture, into the way I hesitated before speaking, even years later, into the way I weighed every word, not out of wisdom, but out of fear of discovering too late that I was silent again. No one ever asked me directly. There were investigations, reports, analyses, language carefully chosen to describe outcomes without touching intention, responsibility distributed in ways that felt mathematical. Systems were blamed, circumstances cited, decisions contextualized. I read some of it, Not all. I did not need to. I knew exactly where my role would never appear. There was a strange comfort in that anonymity, a kind of relief that allowed the guilt to grow undisturbed. If no one accused me, then nothing forced the wound open. It could remain internal, private, unquestioned, just like the warning had been. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I had spoken, not in terms of outcomes. I stopped imagining that. I wondered something smaller, something more personal. I wondered what it would have done to me. Would I have carried embarrassment instead of regret? Would I have been diminished in the system but intact in myself? Would I have learned to live with consequences that followed action instead of silence? Those questions had no answers that mattered, because the person who could have tested them no longer existed. He stayed in that room, in that pause, with his mouth closed and his body still. He remains there, preserved exactly as he was, while I moved on carrying him inside me like an unresolved sentence. I have learned that conscience does not punish immediately. It waits. It allows you to believe you escaped consequence. It lets years pass. It lets you build distance. And then, when nothing can be changed, it reminds you with perfect clarity, not of what happened, of what you recognized before it happened. That is the part that does not soften. I did not need anyone to tell me what my silence meant. I understood it fully, the moment it was no longer useful, and I have understood it every day since. There is no lesson in that understanding, no redemption, no balance restored. Only the knowledge that when the moment came to speak, I knew what should be said, and I didn't say it.